Whoosh! This just in, breaking news, then some even more news, hot off the press, a piping hot scoop for Cody's Shody, some boiling ice cream for you. Are you ready? Racism is over? All right, that doesn't seem right.
White power! Yes!
This must be a typo. There it is. Systemic racism is over. That's much better. That doesn't seem right either. I'm pretty sure I just saw and am seeing a global pandemic disproportionately affect the black community and nationwide protests following the police murder of an unarmed black man and also all the other police murders, but it says it right here on this piece of paper. So where did we get this information?
Systemic racism does not exist.
Oh, okay. It all makes sense now. We just did a recent diversity of thought hire, and so one of our writers is really into the intellectual dark web. A group of smart, dangerous, brillianters. So this is just some person, like you and me and my quarantine roommate, Mr. Bonkers. He's my girlfriend. Anyway, this person, some guy, just said this really incorrect thing out loud in front of a bunch of books that, like, probably have information that refutes what he's saying. And I won't attribute this to lying or ignorance, but it is wrong. And it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to these super secret smart society f***ing dipshits helping people pretend that racism doesn't exist, that history doesn't exist. But rule number one of American history is never underestimate the ability of racist ideas to perpetually reinvent themselves for whole new generations by, not reinventing themselves at all, but packaging themselves in a brand spanking new form. So what is this brand spanking new form, you ask, a two-dimensional rendering of a news dude on your screen for a video that was recorded a few days ago? Well, this dude of news hears you loud and clear. I see you. I mean, not really. But that's what this immensely long video is all about. Because the sadistic murder of George Floyd by police and the disproportionate number of deaths from COVID-19 of black people are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to racism in society. Also, this.
White power! Yes!
But 90% of that iceberg is hidden from view. And though it is readily accessible and well known to many, there is an entire perversion of thought that is obscuring its visibility from a large portion of the population. And if we don't call it out now, it will continue to infect the minds of young people in front of books. And I don't want to have to do this again, you know, in 50 years as I lie in my death pod, but if history is any indication, I will probably have to. So whatever's Martian for like and subscribe. Glorm? Anyway, get comfortable, because things are about to get really uncomfortable. Now, we're all aware of the racist ideas that run on an endless loop on Fox News, like a bigoted version of Groundhog Day, where every day you're like, will Laura Ingraham see her reflection? And you're like, of course she will. She's a Nazi, not a vampire. Anyway, the racism coming from Fox News is clearly a huge problem. But the median age of the Fox News viewer is 65 years old. What we at Cody's Shody Incorporated are going to be examining today is where the younger population is picking up on these ideas that we all hoped would eventually die off with, well, if we're being real, somebody's loved one. But it turns out that there is an entire ecosystem of media figures that is providing a whole new batch of young people with the intellectual framework that underpins their support for racist ideas and racist policies in America. One of the most instrumental influencers impacting impressionable innocence over the past few years is a cluster of political and social commentators that has been dubbed the intellectual dark web. A group of people who are not particularly intellectual or dark, but we're fair and balanced, TMCR, damn it. So admittedly, they are sometimes web. The prominent members of this network of gloomy intelligentsias range in political affiliation and include traditional conservatives, libertarians, never-Trumpers, sometimes Trumpers, and even some liberals. But they are all brought together by their hatred of political correctness, identity politics, social justice warriors, and historical literacy.
Social justice, you should understand, is actually evil. Social justice, when people say it, it's an actual evil. Because anytime you put a modifier in front of a term that is inherently good, you turn it into a perversion of itself.
That's right, comrades! Ben Shapiro wants to cancel adjectives, adverbs, and participle phrases! They are perversions, because if you dare to put a modifier in front of a term that is inherently good, it makes it evil. So, for instance, I think we can all agree that a baby is good, but if you were to say, that is a cute baby, for example, well, that would be a perversion that would make the phrase cute baby evil. But back to the issue at hand, what do these cool kids philosophers have to contribute to the discussion of race in America? Let's start with Dave. The left got a little too PC, so I changed all of my opinions about the economy, social issues, systemic racism, and history. Rubin. Does he have an explanation for his claim that systemic racism doesn't exist?
Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
Ah! Okay, I get it now. There are no laws that treat people differently based on their race, and that is what systemic racism is, isn't it? Isn't that the definition and function of systemic racism? And are you actually claiming that there are no laws that treat people of different races differently? In short, the answer is no to all of it. But we'll get back to those questions. For now, is there anything else you'd like to add, Dave?
Now, that doesn't mean that we can still do better on certain things. So for example, often black people will be incarcerated longer for simple crimes that if a white person committed won't be. Now that has to do with more with socioeconomic reasoning.
Oh, Dave. Immediately after stating that systemic racism doesn't exist, you cite a perfect example of systemic racism, and then explain it away as having to do with socioeconomic reasoning. Another example of systemic racism. I guess in Dave's mind, when you have two interrelated aspects of systemic racism, they sort of cancel each other out. You know how, like, if I were to punch you in the face, but then also kick you in the balls or pussy, those two wrongs mean that you can't get mad at me. It's simple math. Go learn math better, everybody. But of course, Dave made this argument before the recent murder of George Floyd and the ensuing protests. Surely these events would change these guys' minds, right?
Right, when it comes to conspiracy theory, everything can be explained by malevolent people behind the scenes pulling the strings, right? This is the sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Or, by the way, the idea of institutional racism, that a bunch of white people are sitting behind the scenes and deliberately attempting to harm black people. Right? If you're making that argument, you're an idiot.
Oh, hey, you're back with a great point, Ben, my hero. Shapiro. I expect you're watching, Ben, because I know that you watched my video about you, and I know you desperately want to be in a band with me. But according to Ben, institutional racism is actually a conspiracy theory. Because as we all know, when people talk about systemic racism or institutional racism, they are talking about a bunch of white people behind the scenes, in a room, plotting, pulling the strings to deliberately harm black people. Puppeteers! Oh, hey, look! It's my other quarantine roommate, Mr. Strawman! Good to see you again. I love you. I love you too! Gross. Okay, so Ben tells us that systemic racism is a conspiracy theory, and Dave tells us that it doesn't exist. Of course, this begs the question, if systemic racism, under Dave's definition, ended in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which, by the way, was recently gutted by the Supreme Court. And also, like, imagine an apartheid state granting a group civil rights and then being like, we did it! But if we did indeed did it, why does there still remain so much inequality between white people and black people? Any thoughts, Ben?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture.
Now, for context, Ben is answering a question about the cause of wealth inequality between white people and black people. And Ben's response is that it has nothing to do with race, aka racism, and everything to do with culture. Please continue, Ben.
You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened.
So let's put aside the fact that graduation rates, homicide rates, and rates of single motherhood are all results of wealth inequality, and that there is tons of evidence that black people are put in jail for the same crimes as white people at significantly higher rates. But whatever, let's see this argument through. As Ben would say, let's say that the reason black people on average have 10 times less wealth than white people is not because of the cumulative impact of systemic racism, but actually because of black culture and how it doesn't value education and is violent and doesn't have family values. By the way, all very new arguments that have never been made before and are not a part of a long legacy of explaining racial outcomes by creating racist ideas that justify racist policies, which in turn perpetuate racial inequality. Because after all, as Ben asks, is America more racist today than it was in 1960? Now, we'll get back to that question too, but for now, let's continue down this racist rabbit hole and follow this white rabbit and see where it leads us. Yay. But also, huzzah. So, if black culture is to blame, what created that culture? Surely a singular culture for an entire group of people, which every black person shares, was not created in a vacuum. I mean, you're not suggesting that it's some sort of an innate genetic quality, are you?
People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life, and not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups.
No, Sam, I think a lot of people do want to hear that. And that's the problem. But let's leave that alone for now, and how living thought experiment Sam Harris fits into this whole grid of grimy good grade getters, and continue to pull this thread on the sweater of racial obliviousness. Yes, I would like to destroy the sweater. So far, we know that systemic racism does not exist because there are no specific laws that favor one race over the other, and that the reason racial inequality still persists is because of black culture and black intelligence. But what about white privilege? Surely that must play some role in racial inequality.
I want to talk about intersectionality and white privilege a bit.
Oh, goody! Jordan, lobsters show us why human hierarchies exist, also therefore they're good, Peterson. Glad you could join the party. Also, sorry for your recent challenges. I hope you get better, and yet I'm grateful that you've been MIA as of late during all of this situation. Nevertheless, your ideas and words are still influential, so here we are. Now notice that laughter from the crowd when he said that. I mean, you must be getting ready to tell a really hilarious joke, Jordan. For context, the specific list that Peterson is about to reference comes from an essay written by Peggy McIntosh about the everyday advantages that she experiences because she is white.
Okay, so here's her white privilege list, some of it. There's like 50 things. I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. That's actually a wealth thing, by the way.
Oh, a wealth thing, by the way.
Is that white privilege, or is that like majority privilege? Is the same true? You go to China, you're Chinese. It's the same true if you're Chinese? Is it majority privilege? And if it's majority privilege, isn't that just part of living within your culture? So let's say you live in your culture. You're privileged as a member of that culture. Well, obviously, that's what the culture is for. That's what it's for.
So, in a rant about how white privilege isn't real, you state that culture is for providing privileges to the members of the culture. But, what? What definition of culture are you looking at? Culture isn't for anything. Also, he slips this in.
Why would you bother building the damn thing if it didn't accrue benefits to you?
You see, America was built on the backs of white people? Anyway, go on, Doctor.
Now you might say, well, one of the consequences is that it accrues fewer benefits to those who aren't in the culture. Yeah, but you can't immediately associate that with race.
That's literally what you just did, but go on.
It certainly could be wealth.
Wealth, you say.
So white privilege. Well, the other thing you might notice is that to attribute to the individuals of a community the attributes of that community on the basis of their racial identity is called racism. That's what racism is. There's no other way of defining it.
And here Peterson plays a clever or ignorant, I can't decide which, rhetorical trick. No one would argue that attributing a characteristic to an individual based on their race, while not the only way to define it, is not some form of racism. But the concept of white privilege is not ascribing immutable characteristics to individuals based on their race. It is commenting on how a person's race influences their relationship with society. For example, in 1860, you could pretty safely assume that a white person was not enslaved. This would not be a racist assumption, and would also be a pretty good example of white privilege at that time in our history, when we did the slave stuff. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Where were we? Ah, yes. So not only does white privilege not exist, but this concept is actually racist against white people. Anyone else share that view?
So white privilege is a myth and a lie and should be completely destroyed. It's rooted in racism. It is a racist idea.
White privilege isn't reality. It's a cowardly way, a chicken way, to blame someone else for your failures to live up to decent, responsible standards.
Ben! It's good to see you again, all the time, every time. I miss you. And hey, it's also Charlie Kirk! Are you part of the nerds of nefarious netting? I mean, with comments like that, I'm sure you'll get in soon. They love idiots and liars. But to be fair and balanced, Charlie is right. White privilege is rooted in racism. Good point, Charlie Kirk. Okay, so according to the social order of sullen smarty pants wearers, white privilege is a myth and a lie and racist, and racial inequality could not possibly be related to white privilege. But lucky for us, David Rubin knows exactly where this violent, lazy culture that doesn't value family or education comes from.
But if you think about this, if you think about the worst places in the United States for black people to live in terms of economics, in terms of shootings, it's Chicago, it's Ferguson, it's Atlanta. It's these places that have been run by Democrats almost exclusively for 80 years. Yet the Democrats keep saying we're for black people. So it's sort of like saying, I'm a progressive, I'm for progressive. It sounds good. Well, I'm for black people. Everyone's for black, unless you're a true racist, you're for black people the same way you should be for everybody else. So they've tricked you into thinking, I mean, Chicago, I would guess, someone should check the numbers on this, but I'm gonna guess about 50 to 80 people, black people, were shot in Chicago this past weekend. You never hear about that because it's mostly black on black crime. Well, if the Democrats are so good at fixing these problems, why is it that in their cities, it's always the worst? And it's because they create these incentives that are actually disincentives. And if you give people things, it becomes very hard to not want those things anymore.
It's the left! They created a victim mentality and a culture of dependency by giving black people free stuff. Uncle Sugar gave black people goodies like welfare and food stamps and Obama phones. Now, I'm not suggesting that systemic racism is not a bipartisan problem. It clearly is. Recent events have made this abundantly clear, if it was not already abundantly clear. But is the problem with the left that they give away too much free stuff to black people? Not only that, but that they can't even govern their own communities properly? Is that the problem, Ben?
Flint is governed by minorities. I mean, the folks who are, the mayor of Flint was black at the time. The folks who were involved in the Flint water crisis were of minority descent. It wasn't white people cramming down a situation on Flint. By the way, they're all Democrat.
That's right, folks. It was black Democrats that created the Flint water crisis and poisoned their own community. It's not like an emergency manager, Ed Kurtz, incidentally a white guy, appointed by Republican Governor Rick Snyder, also a white guy, who was given the power to completely circumvent the democratically elected mayor and city council, made the decision to change Flint's water supply to the Flint River without implementing the anti-corrosion treatment that was necessary to prevent the acidic water from corroding the lead pipes in the city, and thus irreparably poisoning thousands of residents. Is it? Yes, it is, Ben. But I'm getting off track here. Where were we? Oh yes, free stuff given to black people by the left to create a culture of dependency. This country has given so much free stuff to black people. You have any examples of this, Dave?
And I can give you, I know that anecdotal stuff isn't always the best way, but I can give you one very good example. My sister lives on the Upper West Side of New York City. It's a nice area. She pays a ton to live in a nice area with a doorman building in New York City. A good portion of her building, I think it might be 50%, is rent subsidized, meaning that they're keeping rents low for certain people of certain ethnicities to live there.
Wait a minute. I thought you just said that there are no laws that treat people of different races or ethnicities differently, Dave. Weird. Also weird, because they don't subsidize rent for people of other ethnicities. They subsidize rent for poor people. Wonder what that's about. Anyway, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. It's easy to get lost in the marketplace of ideas. A lot of impulse buys, you know? So now we have assessed their interpretation of the causes of racial inequality. The reason black people suffer from inequality is because of their culture. A culture created by the left who redistribute our hard-earned tax dollars to these indolent, undeserving, food stamp hoarding, not very hardworking people. So how do we fix it? I mean, surely a group as intellectual as the dark web has a solution.
So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful. And in fact, I think it's actually quite hurtful to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem.
If you get intersectional enough, one of the things that happens is that you break the groups all the way down to the level of the individual.
We should want equal laws for everybody, and then within that is what empowers you as an individual to go out and get what's yours.
The punchline here is that everyone has to be treated as an individual.
Okay. There it is. So, according to the web of dark intellectuals, the only solution is to treat everyone as individuals. By the way, as we, the dark intellectual web, say this, we will continue to talk about the deficiencies of black culture, the racial IQ gap, black on black crime, etc., etc., etc. But it's just like MLK said, bro. Judge me by the content of my character, man, not by the yada, 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 yada. These guys love this quote. And I wonder if there's another more relevant quote of his that they should read. But it doesn't actually sound so bad, does it? I mean, of course, we want everyone to see us and treat us as individuals and judge us by the content of our character, not the yada, 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 and so on. So what's the problem, news dude, you ask? Well, before we take this argument apart, point by point, let's briefly summarize the deceitful grift that is catching so many young people today in its intellectual dark web. First, they erroneously define systemic racism and white privilege, and then proceed to destroy an argument that no one was ever making in the first place. By doing this, they create a scenario where you can't possibly assign the cause of racial inequality in our society to systemic racism or white privilege because they have just seemingly disproved these concepts entirely. So this leaves no other explanation for the existence of racial inequality other than that it must be a result of an inequality in Black people themselves. Their culture, their IQ, their decision-making capacity. And of course, all the free stuff they get from the lefty government we definitely have, which creates a culture of dependency. Now, you are in a position where you have been insidiously convinced that Black people are inherently not equal to white people in some fundamental way. At this point, you only have one out without seeming like an overt racist. And that is to say that you don't see race at all. You're colorblind, man. And you just treat everyone as individuals. And the mechanism that holds this all together is the dissemination of the racist ideas that uphold this perverted philosophy. If you've traveled this far, congratulations. You have now been turned into a racist. Either an active racist or a passive racist, but a racist nonetheless. Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist, perfectly describes this dynamic.
What post-racial ideas say to people, to everyday people, is basically racist policy no longer exists. And it says that to people in a nation of racial inequity, in a nation of racial segregation. And so then it causes the individual to be like, okay, why does all of these inequities and disparities exist? If it's not racist policy, if it's not racial terror, then it must be something wrong with a particular racial group.
Right.
So let's try to unturn you, shall we? We'll start with the original assertion from David Rubin that systemic racism doesn't exist because there are no laws that favor one race over another. The first question to ask is that what systemic racism is? Laws that explicitly favor one race over another? No, of course not. In fact, many scholars define racism itself as a system. For starters, there is the fact that many of the laws that make racial discrimination illegal are often broken and not well enforced. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, reminder, recently gutted by the Supreme Court, granted certain protections in an attempt to make sure that Black people were able to exercise their right to vote, including a pre-clearance provision, which would have likely prevented the recent debacle in Georgia. Just because something is illegal doesn't mean it doesn't still happen. States across the country have enacted laws that courts have eventually found to be racially discriminatory. But often those laws aren't overturned until years of legal battles, long after the intended effect has already had the result of disenfranchising Black voters. The impact of these policies that include voter suppression and racist gerrymandering is evident in states like North Carolina, one of 3 states in 2018 where the GOP lost the popular vote, but somehow still managed to win a majority in the state House of Representatives. You know, the same way our racist president won through the verifiably racist and undemocratic electoral college system. Now, second, laws don't need to mention race at all to be oppressive towards Black people. The Constitution doesn't even use the word slave until the 13th Amendment, the one that freed the enslaved people. And before that, it's not like we didn't have a system of slavery in this country. It's like a law needs to use the N-word for Dave and this grubby group of geeks to consider it to be a part of systemic racism. There have been many laws since the 1960s that have specifically disadvantaged Black people without explicitly referencing race at all. This country is very good at doing that. It's like our superpower. Consider the fact that for decades, there was a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, despite the fact that they are both made from essentially the same substance and the dangers and addiction levels are incredibly similar. Do you know what was different? Black people were more likely to get arrested and incarcerated for using crack than white people, despite equal use. In 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act changed this disparity, but the ratio is still 18-to-1. So, thanks, Joe Biden? In fact, as David himself inexplicably noted, immediately following his rejection of the existence of systemic racism, the war on drugs puts black people in jail at far higher rates for non-violent drug crimes, despite the fact that white people and black people use and sell drugs at the same rates. Also, thanks, Joe Biden, for being better than Donald Trump. You did it. Congratulations. You hopped over that bar. And as with many components of systemic racism, the negative impact of laws like these on people's lives are compounded by other racist laws. Getting swept up into the criminal justice system for a nonviolent drug crime can mean that you lose your right to vote and that you have to check a box on a job application indicating that you are a felon. And you can be barred from certain government services like public housing. But as Dave says, that has to do with more socioeconomic reasoning. So let's talk about those socioeconomic reasons, Dave. Because as I mentioned, laws that explicitly favor one race over another is not the definition of systemic racism. Systems are comprised of many components, not just laws. For example, there are policies that govern everything from your workplace to local municipalities all the way up to the federal government that are not laws, but are very much a part of systemic racism in America and greatly impact the socioeconomic status of black people. For example, the system of wealth accumulation has created perhaps the most persistent, insidious, and consequential legacy when it comes to the history of systemic racism in this country, resulting in a staggering disparity between white people and black people. But is it, as Ben Shapiro claims, because of black culture? No, but let's first consider the fact that the majority of the wealth that people accumulate over their lifetimes comes from two places: inheritance and home ownership. Considering black people were enslaved for over 200 years, meaning they were not paid for their labor, and then lived under Jim Crow segregation laws for the next 90 years, I would say that it has been pretty hard for black people to accumulate wealth via inheritance under those conditions. And this is not ancient history. I mean, there are people alive today whose parents were enslaved. So how about home ownership? Well, let's listen to what Richard Rothstein, author of a book, The Color of Law, has to say about the way housing policy has been implemented in this country.
And the reason is another federal program run by the Federal Housing Administration that subsidized the movement of white families out of central cities into single-family homes in the suburbs that were exclusively white. So the federal government guaranteed loans to mass production builders. The most famous example, perhaps, is Levittown. Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. He got loans guaranteed by the federal government on explicit condition, I want to emphasize that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home in the development had to have a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans.
The white Americans who were given government-backed mortgages for homes under this policy paid less per month to own a home than what black Americans paid for rent in public housing during this period. Those homes have since increased in value, netting those families $200,000 to $300,000 of added wealth. So, is the racial wealth gap really a result of black culture?
African American income on average is about 60% of white income. African American wealth is 5 to 7% of white wealth. Most families in this country gain their wealth through housing equity. This enormous difference between 60% income ratio and 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s. So the wealth gap, I think, is attributable to this residential segregation.
It is obvious that a huge part of the racial wealth gap can be attributed to the federally sanctioned housing policies of this country, which included redlining, a means by which loans were explicitly and intentionally denied to individuals in black, redlined neighborhoods, and where state-backed restrictive covenants denied black people the opportunity to move into wealthier white neighborhoods. And so not only were black people not able to inherit wealth from their parents and grandparents, who were enslaved, but they were denied the opportunity to build wealth for themselves. It wasn't until 1977 that discrimination in lending for housing was outlawed. This meant that black people were relegated into living in areas of highly concentrated poverty with elevated levels of pollution due to their proximity to freeways and toxic facilities, which caused lower life expectancy and a lack of access to upward mobility. And insidiously, the racist segregation policies that created this concentrated poverty also led to over-policing, which led to mass incarceration, which led to the loss of political power, which meant that these communities were not equipped with the political power to oppose the creation of big polluters, which led to even further loss of property values, which led to less funding for education, which led to. So given this, it's not that surprising that 1 in 7 white families today are millionaires compared to 1 in 50 black families. Or that while single white women between the ages of 36 to 49 have a median net worth of $42,000, and single black women in this same age range have a median net worth of $5. As Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the 1619 Project, recently noted on the Ezra Klein Show,
what the census data shows is that actually lower income white Americans have more wealth than middle class black Americans, and lower income white Americans live in wealthier neighborhoods than middle income black Americans.
This is all so weird, you know? It's almost as if the racial inequality we see in this country is not caused by black culture, but by some sort of like a system, some sort of system that seems to involve a race somehow that gave white people some sort of like, I don't want to call it privilege, but I do, because that's what it is. So remember when Jordan Peterson said, it's not white privilege, it's wealth? Well, it turns out that wealth is a white privilege. A government-subsidized white privilege, and an important component to systemic racism that aggregates and grows over generations. So, you see, Ben, it doesn't really matter if we are more or less racist today than we were in 1960, because the inequities of our past collect interest. It's just also perplexing. I mean, I thought all the free stuff that created this culture of dependency was given to black people. I mean, that's why they're so lazy, right? I mean, all the free stuff incentivizes them to just be welfare queens and live off of Uncle Sugar, right? I mean, but then could it be that this free stuff from the government has actually been given to white people? Well, Doy Hickey, the Homestead Act, first enacted in 1862, literally gave away 10% of all land in the United States almost exclusively to white people. It is estimated that nearly 46 million people living today can trace their wealth back to this act. Around the same time, slavery was abolished, and yet the formerly enslaved got nothing. Not even their 40 acres and a mule. When Social Security was enacted to provide a safety net for the elderly, 2 industries were curiously omitted from these benefits: agricultural workers and domestic servants. Coincidentally, occupations dominated by Black, Mexican, and Asian workers. The Wagner Act gave workers the right to create unions and the right to exclude Black people from those unions, which they did. They did do that. So, according to their logic, it's actually white people that should have a culture of dependency. And in a way, we do. We have a dependency on whiteness, or what famed sociologist, historian, and civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois dubbed the psychological wages of whiteness. After all, as Dr. Jordan Balthazar Peterson has told us,
that's what the culture is for. That's what it's for.
I love how ferociously ignorant Dr. Jordan Bumblebee Peterson is about how he just made an argument for the existence of white privilege in this comment. As I already stated, culture is not for anything, but the social construction of whiteness surely is. But news, dude! Judge me by the content of the character, not by the... clearly, the history of this nation has not judged black people by the... Now, I'm not saying that there are not white people in this country who are suffering or experiencing poverty. There clearly are. And we should do a whole lot more to help them. And poor people as a society. It's also true that often poor whites become the collateral damage of racist policies like the war on drugs, and that throughout our history, politicians and corporate interests have stoked the flames of racism to prevent the forming of multiracial coalitions built on shared economic interests in order to maintain their power. In fact, the creation of American anti-black racism stems from this dynamic. And time again, we see that white people opt to maintain their privileged whiteness, despite the fact that it is often not in their interest to do so.
When they don't expand Medicare in the South, in the former Confederate states, when we don't have universal health care, despite the fact that every other country who looks like us has it, when we have the lowest rate of union membership, when we have the stingiest maternal leave, like the stingiest social safety net period, is because poll after poll shows if white Americans think that a lot of black people will benefit from a social program, they oppose it.
And so politicians use this to essentially trick white people into voting against their own self-interests. So which groups are weaponizing identity politics again? The truth is that the notions that we should just be colorblind and treat everyone as individuals are often code words for unfettered capitalism. Just live and let live, man. Just do whatever. These ideas are used as a Trojan horse for rolling back regulations and reducing the role of government in our lives, aka gutting the social safety net at the expense of the vulnerable and to the benefit of the rich and powerful. It completely ignores the central role that history has played in the fortunes of individuals that have been born into groups that have been unjustly treated by society. You can start to see why this solution of just treating everyone as individuals, particularly in the arena of public policy, is problematic, considering that the history of this nation has not treated people as individuals. Perhaps history matters.
I have not criticized you, and I continue to not, for having the conversation. I've criticized you for having the conversation without dealing with and separating it out and thinking through the context and the weight of American history on it. Not the weight of American history.
The weight of American history is completely irrelevant to...
No, it can't possibly be irrelevant on something that even you admit is environmental.
The only thing that is relevant... So yes, but that part of the conversation has been had. You don't have to talk about slavery. You don't have to talk about the specific injustices in the past to have a conversation about the environmental factors that very likely keep people back.
No, Sam! You absolutely do have to talk about those things. Because besides the fact that the quote-unquote racial IQ gap has significantly narrowed in the amount of time that could not possibly be ascribed to genetic factors, the fact is, the entire enterprise of attempting to study the genetics of race and intelligence is built on a foundation of bullshit. Because, and I don't think I've said this yet, but race is not real. It is a social construct. We made it up. Like money! There is no genetic or biological legitimacy to the concept of race whatsoever. There is more genetic diversity within racial groups than between them. A black person could be more genetically similar to a white person than to another black person. There is more genetic diversity with black people than any other racial group because, we all came from Africa. Originally, we're all Africans. We spent a majority of our time on this planet, on this one continent. We should be proud of our African heritage. And even if you insist on making some sort of racial distinction, according to Ancestry.com, the average African American has about 30% European ancestry. You know, because partially the rape of enslaved people. Looking at you, Thomas Jefferson, you founding father of America, you. And then add on top of that the other layer of bullshit to this debate that the very concept of intelligence is completely subjective and breathtakingly complex, and the idea that we could come up with a single test and number to accurately measure it or proclaim to understand its significance or be able to quantify it on a genetic level is absurd. There is no gene for intelligence. And so the endeavor of seeking out and comparing the genetic factors involved in intelligence to groups that are not genetically defined, but socially constructed, is by very definition an invalid scientific endeavor. It rests on entirely unscientific notions about the nature of race and intelligence. The fact is that the only aim of this project is to reinforce the notion that there is something inherently and innately inferior about black people. As Ezra Klein states, throughout our history,
European descended white men of scientific mind looked around them, looked at the society they saw, looked at the outcomes people had in the society they saw, looked at the science pulled from those outcomes, right? And it was called science back then too, and said, you know what? What we are seeing here is a result of innate differences between the races.
So let's pause for a moment and consider how this web of intellectual darks could be so thoroughly and embarrassingly wrong about race in America. Now, to be clear, these guys don't all universally share the same views on every issue. That's the appeal of the association of the clever guys. Sam Harris would not claim that systemic racism doesn't exist at all. And even Jordan Peterson has acknowledged that it's a factor that contributes to inequality.
One of the factors. One of many, many factors.
So, while Sam Harris, a prominent atheist and self-proclaimed liberal, may seem like an unlikely member of this brainy bleak batch, he is also part of the problem, and has thrown in his lot with these right-wing reactionaries, because it turns out they have a lot in common. For starters, they all share a disdain for the left and their supposed suppression of a free exchange of ideas. Sam believes that the left has deemed it not okay to talk about anything to do with race and gender. Yet when it comes to the issue of reparations, he thinks we should wait a couple of years before we have that conversation.
I'm totally open-minded on the reparations issue, but talk about another way to lose to Trump, right? I mean, this is, let's wait 2 years before we have this conversation.
And the truth is, they all share the broad strokes of the same explanation for racial inequality. That the cause of racial inequality is in large measure due to the innate characteristics of black people, their genetics, and their culture, and that the solution to this problem is for society to become colorblind, and for black people to, pick themselves up by their bootstraps, a thing that is possible. These basic ideas are not new, but the most recent configuration of this fundamental error in reasoning, which has equipped a generation of young people with the rationale to justify racial inequality and racist policies with racist ideas, and/or the racist ideas to serve as a justification for racial inequality and racist policies. Take your pick. So when you consider the level of crime in the black population, if you were Sam Harris, you might conclude that this is evidence of a cultural problem.
At minimum, we have a cultural problem that has to be solved. And only the black community can really solve it. I mean, this is something, it's like, and on some level, understanding the origins, even if we knew that the origin of the problem was white racism. We have slavery, we have Jim Crow, and then we have a direct, just line of falling dominoes to the problem of inner city violence, for, black teenagers. Let's just say that was true. that still doesn't tell you what the remedy is now. I mean, how do you get people to live different lives now and to value their lives?
So, according to Sam, even if the origins of violence in the black community lie in our history of racism and racist policies, now it's just up to those violent blacks to change their culture. Might I humbly suggest that perhaps we try things like investing in black communities, funding public education or housing, or public health, or ending the war on drugs before we bolster the claim that an extreme minority of violent offenders in a population of 42 million people in this country is an indicator that this community has the cultural problem of not valuing their lives? The truth is that this grid of grimy geniuses fall very neatly into a long legacy of white people who have explained away racial inequality, justified by all sorts of scientific theories and racist ideas about black genetics and black culture in order to perpetuate racist policies, which maintains the status quo of black inequality while anointing white people with privilege in society. And interestingly, the racist ideas always seem to perfectly adapt to the particular inequality and racist policy of the time. Thomas Jefferson stated that, "Never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration." This racist idea served the function of justifying the brutality of slavery. And when Ben Shapiro says the following, well, just take a listen.
Well, New York City now wants to shut down these highly gifted programs specifically on the basis of the lie that New York City's schools are being divided not by academic performance, but based on race. Well, maybe the alternative is that black and Hispanic kids are not doing as well on the test to get into the gifted programs.
That's right, Ben. It's not that schools are more segregated today than they were in the late 1960s because of racist policies that relegated so many black people into areas of concentrated poverty and denied black people the ability to accumulate wealth, which has resulted in their children being undereducated in a public school system that is largely and inexplicably funded by property taxes. It's because they're not doing well on the tests, you know, because of their culture and their dumb IQs. Judge me by my test score, man, not by the something of my etc. This racist idea is being used as a way to justify the inequality of education in this country. So I guess it's time for a brief segment called, "If you're poor, your schools are considerably worse. How fucking stupid and evil is that? What the f***?" To reiterate, public schools are largely funded by property taxes. The higher the value of the homes in a given neighborhood, the more revenue from property taxes a neighborhood is able to collect for their schools. Not only have black people been historically banned from purchasing homes in white neighborhoods, but the homes in majority black neighborhoods have been devalued specifically because they were majority black areas. And I don't have the data, but I would venture to guess that the bake sales and car washes in wealthier majority white communities probably tend to raise a bit more money than they do in the systemically impoverished majority black communities in this country. As a result, today, school districts where the majority of students enrolled are students of color receive $23 billion less in education funding than predominantly white school districts, despite serving the same number of students. If that's not systemic racism, I don't know what is. There's no law that explicitly says schools where a majority of students are black shall be funded less than schools with majority white populations, and yet it is not a coincidence that that is the case. So, yeah, I guess this concludes our segment of, "If you're poor, your schools are considerably worse. How fucking stupid and evil is that? What the f***?" The legacy of racist laws from the past and the impact of the systemic racism of today snowball over time. The policies that gave white people wealth swell and expand from one generation to the next. The laws that denied black people opportunities spread and infect nearly every aspect of life. And this dynamic is supported by the dissemination of racist myths. We're all familiar with the current tropes of blacks are lazy, blacks are violent, and so on. But throughout our history, the impact of racist policies have been justified by the creation of new and absurd ideas. In the early 1970s, a Johnson-era policy with the goal of increasing black homeownership was taken over by the Nixon administration, and it did not go well. The program was quickly exploited by the predatory actions of banks, speculators, and real estate agents who were bribing FHA appraisers behind the scenes in order to inflate the values of housing in order to line their pockets with this new influx of cash from the federal government. In order to pull off this heist, they took advantage of low-income black people who qualified for the program by placing them into substandard and often condemned housing, not fit for human habitation, leaving these families with homes that were falling apart but with no resources to make the necessary repairs. When this comes out, it becomes a major scandal, making the front page news in every major city in America. But then, something interesting starts to happen to the narrative. This is how Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, author of the book Race for Profit, describes what happened next.
The focus almost immediately shifts to the program participants, and the conditions of the house are those because black women don't actually know how to keep a clean house, which of course is richly ironic because many of these congressmen had black women cleaning their own homes. This becomes a central part of the story, and the role of the banks, the role of the real estate industry kind of began to fade into the background.
And yet, somehow, this system of sinister smarties tries to pretend that this history doesn't matter. Like the world just started yesterday. We're all just individuals, my man. If you aren't able to succeed in this free country, well, that is on you, man. I mean, sure, there were racist people back in the day, but systemic racism today, that doesn't exist. And so, as Sam Harris often likes to do, let's do a thought experiment in a segment that we'll call The American Race. Let's imagine that the path for different races to succeed in America was a literal race. More precisely, a relay race, from one generation to the next, over the course of 400 years. For the purposes of this segment, we'll use the popular video game Mario Kart as an analogy. Fun! In this analogy, the blacks will be represented by Luigi, and the whites will be represented by Mario. These characters were picked totally at random, 100% randomly picked. Okay, let's do this. The American Race. On your marks, get set, go! Mario's off to an amazing start. He's taking away the land from native Shy Guys, giving them capes infected with smallpox. Nice move. Mario is speeding fast around the tracks, folks. But hey, Luigi doesn't seem to be going anywhere because he's locked in chains. It's weird for a race. When is he gonna get off the starting block? It looks like he's gonna be stuck there for about 250 years. I don't know, folks. Is it just me, or does it look like Luigi has a small brain? Science says yes. Whoa! Princess Peach just signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and Luigi is off to the races! Mario may have a 250-year head start, but Luigi is finally in the race, folks! Uh-oh! It's the Ku Klux Klan! Tough break for Weege! He just got lynched! But hey, Mario just got some free land from the kingdom through the Let's-A-Go-Stead Act, and he has increased his lead and passed the baton to his son, who will inherit his wealth. Unfortunately, Luigi's son is inheriting his father's debt to the man who formerly enslaved his family and must now turn over his entire harvest through a system called sharecropping. I don't know if it's culture or genetics, but one thing is for sure, Luigi is just lazy. But good news for Mario and his descendants. That free land from the government is growing in wealth, and he has widened his lead over Luigi. What a hard worker, folks. Uh-oh, it's the Great Depression. Both contestants are struggling. How will this race turn out? Oh, wow-wee! Mario gets a huge boost because of New Deal programs, but mostly his merit. Luigi, on the other hand, well, he's just an inferior racer. Oh no! It's the Goombas! Luigi, we need you! Help us win this war! We promise we'll be nice! Thanks, Mario! You won the war! Here is a house and a free education and prosperity. Wowee! You are winning this race because you are just so fast. And hey, Luigi, you, what's that? You want a house? College! Luigi, you cut up! I mean, sure. But whoa! Mario is killing it right now and widening his lead. And Luigi, well, he lost a long time ago. Hey, okay, Luigi, you want some rights? Fine. I guess you can, you know, vote. And I guess you don't have to drink from a different water fountain, but I'd really prefer it if you did. But you don't have to. But I'd really prefer it if you did. Okay, I'm getting kind of freaked out here. Luigi is starting to gain a little bit on Mario. He must be cheating. Oh, thank God, and the CIA. It's crack. Luigi is on crack. Lock him up, folks. Throw away the key. Whew. Meanwhile, it looks like Mario got an item box with cocaine in it. What fun he must be having! Whoa! What a burst of speed you got from your bonus cocaine! Mario is going way fast and passing on even more wealth to his children. What a virtuous man who earned everything he has through his hard work. And what a disappointment Luigi has been. He got caught with those drugs, abandoned his family. I guess that's what happens when you have no family values. What's that, Luigi? We don't hand out coins to undeserving welfare princesses. Mario earned everything he has because he was just so fast. I can't help it if you're just super slow, Luigi. I mean, Alberto is president, so as far as I'm concerned, let's just forget about the past, okay? And start the race now! Wow, Luigi, why are you so far behind? You must be slow and violent and dumb. And I can't believe you are being so unfair to Mario, who just wants everyone to be treated equally. Uh-oh, Luigi just got COVID-19. Guess he couldn't grasp the concept of social distancing, probably because of his low IQ. Wow, surprise, surprise, Mario wins and will always win because he is the best and fastest. And Luigi is just genetically and culturally and innately slower and dumber. And he just makes such bad decisions. And this is why Mario will always win and Luigi will always lose. What a good race. So, is the solution really to just treat everyone as individuals? Well, yeah, of course. And no, obviously not. On a person-to-person level, sure. But from a public policy perspective, no. Because if you could wave a magic wand and erase racism from the hearts of every single person in America, you would still have systemic racism and the effects of it. Getting rid of individual racists doesn't change the racial wealth gap or the disparities in life expectancy or education. In fact, adopting a colorblind policy just codifies and cements the inequality that has been generated by systemic racism over generations. It makes it a permanent fixture of society. You can have racism without racists. In fact, that's the name of a book written by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. You know, there are actually a lot of books written about the history of racism in America, like thousands of books. And I would strongly suggest that the certified members of the Dunces of Darkness read one of these books, maybe two, because this history is not unknowable. Most of the ideas and concepts in this video are from these books, because I'm not that smart. But other people are, and I haven't even had a chance to get into countless other examples of systemic racism, like the health impact of the constant and persistent anxiety inflicted by racism, the disproportionate mortality rates of black women in pregnancy and childbirth, the racist ideas doctors have regarding the degree to which black people can feel pain, racism in hiring, racism in school disciplinary actions, etc., etc., etc. Like, I've barely even referenced racial terror and racist violence, like the fact that the KKK, the OG terrorist organization, has murdered an estimated 100,000 people throughout our history. The truth is that it would take me like 400 years to describe our country's history of systemic racism and white supremacy. But recent events have illuminated its impact. Is it surprising that black Americans are more likely to contract the coronavirus, considering they are less likely to have a job that they can do from home, more likely to be an essential worker, more likely to have to take public transportation to get to that job, and more likely to live in a multi-generational household? Not only that, but the Trump administration has enacted a policy to deny relief loans to business owners with criminal records. And so, unless you haven't been watching this video and decided to randomly skip to the end, I think you know precisely who that policy will disproportionately impact. Nope! Is it any surprise that black Americans are dying at 3 times the rate of white Americans from COVID-19? When we know that black Americans are more likely to live in food deserts, live in polluted areas, and disproportionately suffer from the comorbidities associated with death from COVID-19. So get ready for the racist ideas that justify this racial inequity. I predict that we will start hearing newly invented racist myths about how black people enjoy coughing in each other's faces, or don't wash their hands, or, oh, there it is, right on cue. And so I will conclude this marathon of a YouTube video by asking this. Is the answer to addressing racial inequality to ignore our history and its impact, and instead be colorblind in our policies and judge people by the content of their character? Just like MLK said, man! Should we just tell black people in America to pull themselves up by their bootstraps?
America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
Okay, Marty. Counterpoint. Straw man, anything? Okay. Nuh-uh. Woo! Hey! Thanks for watching that entire video, which I know you did. And if you did and liked it, make sure to like it on the video and subscribe to the channel. And the comments can be nice or mean. I don't care. Do you like this new bit where the pages are blank, but also the pencil is empty? Ha ha ha. Also, we have a podcast called Even More News and a Patreon. Ah!